The crew of Aurora walked slowly through the towering neon skyscrapers of Xyphos Prime. The sky was filled with glowing airships, and the streets bustled with holographic signs, high-tech armored guards, and a variety of humanoid species moving about. Emma and her team followed Kyle, but Kyle was different. He looked more confident and determined than ever before. As they passed through a narrow corridor, the massive palace gates opened before them. The guards hesitated for a brief moment upon seeing Kyle, then silently lowered their heads in respect and stepped aside. Sam leaned in toward Emma and whispered, "What's going on here? Who is Kyle?" Before Emma could answer, Kyle came to a stop. His eyes were locked onto the grand figure sitting in the middle of the throne room. This man was the king of Xyphos Prime, and Kyle was his son. The king sat upon his throne, clad in gold-plated armor. His cold, piercing gaze rested on Kyle. "Kyle," he finally spoke, his voice echoing through the throne room. "So, you have returned." Liam stared at Emma in shock. "Kyle, are you a prince?" Kyle lowered his head slightly, but his voice was steady. "Yes, my father is the ruler of Xyphos Prime, and I am its heir." A heavy silence filled the room, almost tangible. Everyone had thought Kyle was just another traveler, another crew member of Aurora, but he was the heir to an entire planet. The king stood up from his throne, his footsteps echoing like distant thunder. Finally, he stopped before Kyle and turned his gaze toward the crew. "Who are they?" he asked sternly. Emma stepped forward, meeting the king's gaze with unwavering confidence. "We are the crew of Aurora. We have faced many dangers in our journey, and Kyle is our friend." The king paused for a moment, then gave a small, almost amused smile. "My son's friends. Interesting." Kyle stepped closer to his father. "We have come here for a reason. The Xel'Thari threat is everywhere, and we need your help to stop them." The king's expression changed instantly. It became serious, almost troubled. "Xel'Thari," he repeated. Emma realized why Kyle was so determined. Coming here wasn't just about confronting his past. He wanted to use Xyphos Prime's strength against the Xel'Thari. Sam finally broke the silence. "King, do you know of the Xel'Thari?" The king took a deep breath and nodded. "They are the greatest threat to our universe. But stopping them is much more difficult than you imagine." Kyle and the crew exchanged glances. Here, on this planet, the secrets of the past would be revealed. But, at the same time, the first steps of a great war were being taken. And now, it was time to choose a side. The king listened carefully to Kyle's words before stepping back to his throne. A heavy silence settled over the grand hall. Emma and the crew stood still, trying to suppress the growing tension inside them. At last, the king spoke, his voice sharp and authoritative. "The Xel'Thari, their very name brings fear. Long ago, Xyphos Prime felt their shadow. But we did not go to war. Instead, we found a way to protect ourselves." Kyle narrowed his eyes. "Protect? What do you mean, Father?" The king rested his hands on the arms of his throne and met Kyle's gaze. "We made a deal with them." The room turned ice cold. Everyone froze. "What?" Emma whispered, in shock. The king lowered his head. Instead of engaging us in direct war, the Xel'Thari agreed to leave us alone on one condition. We were never to cross their borders, and we accepted. We did not interfere with them, and they did not interfere with us. Kyle's eyes burned with fury. So, you made a deal with them. You had the power to stop them, but instead, you chose to protect only Xyphos Prime and left the rest of the universe to its fate. The king remained silent. Emma turned to Kyle. This changes everything. We came here to stop the Xel'Thari. But if Xyphos Prime has a pact with them, if the king helps us, hell be breaking that pact. Max furrowed his brows. And if that happens, Xyphos Prime will become their next target. The king took a deep breath and lowered his gaze. Yes, that is why I cannot help you. Kyle clenched his fists and stepped forward, his voice filled with defiance. No, I refuse to accept this. You are the ruler of Xyphos Prime. But I am your son, and I will fight the Xel'Thari. The king's sharp gaze hardened. If you do this, you will no longer be my heir. Kyle flinched. Even Emma took a step back. Zoe intervened. Are you seriously saying a father would turn his back on his son like this? Kyle isn't just fighting for Xyphos Prime, has fighting for the entire galaxy. The king let out a slow breath. I protect Xyphos Prime, and only Xyphos Prime. The rest of the galaxy is not my concern. Liam scoffed. That's easy to say. But when the Xel'Thari take everything, Xyphos Prime will fall too. The king remained seated, unmoving. But Kyle wasn't going to stop. The son took a step back and spoke with steel in his voice. Then I will build my own army. The atmosphere in the throne room shifted. Even the guards exchanged uncertain glances. The king narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Kyle held his head high. If Xyphos Prime's army won't fight the Xel'Thari, I will find those who will. I will start a rebellion. Emma and the crew exchanged glances. This was far bigger than they had anticipated. The king studied his son for a long moment, then lowered his head and smiled bitterly. So be it, Kyle nodded. Yes, father, I will not bow to your fear. The king closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, his voice was steady. Then you are no longer the heir to Xyphos Prime. Kyle held his breath for just a moment. He hadn't expected his father to make such a final decision. But then he straightened. So be it, he said quietly. Then, turning to Emma and the crew, he commanded, We're leaving. But just as he stepped toward the doors, the king spoke again. Kyle, he said. Kyle stopped, but did not turn around. If you truly intend to rally the people of Xyphos Prime, the king hesitated. You will have to go through me. Emma tried to understand what the king meant, but Kyle only bowed his head, if necessary. Then the doors opened, and a revolution began. Kyle, Emma, and the crew stepped out of the palace and into the neon-lit streets of Xyphos Prime. But they were no longer just explorers. They were the spark of a revolution. Kyle quickened his pace, his anger not at his father's decision, but at the people of Xyphos Prime being condemned to blind silence in the face of the Xel'Thari threat. Emma caught up to him. "Kyle, what do we do now? You don't have an army, but you must have a plan." Kyle shook his head. "There are people on Xyphos Prime who think like me. Those who fear my father but know the truth. If we show them the real threat, they will fight alongside us." Sam muttered, "But how? The people here might see the Xel'Thari as nothing more than a myth. How do we prove they're real?" Kyle stopped for a moment, then turned to the crew. His eyes were filled with determination. "We bring them here." And so, the first battle of the revolution began.